Great. All right. So what is carbon removal NYC? So this is for public audiences, and we host speakers who are scientists and professionals who are studying and working on carbon removal. So the intention here is to incubate conversations, relationships, initiatives, businesses, and legislative action, anything that can be pushed forward to help the reduction of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And specifically, we look at carbon removal here in this group. So what is carbon removal? Carbon removal is a process of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and keeping it out for decades, centuries, or millennia. This is the definition that I use. There are lots of definitions for carbon removal. There are a couple key points in here. First of all, carbon removal is taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that was not already there. So it's distinct from reducing emissions. And I like to include in my definition that the carbon is staying out for a very long time, because there are some ways that carbon can be removed from the atmosphere where it doesn't stay out for as long, but that doesn't have very much of an impact on climate goals. So this could slow, limit, or even reverse climate change, but it's not a substitute for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really important for us to emphasize anytime that we talk about carbon removal, that cutting greenhouse gas emissions and really getting to zero net emissions is crucial for climate goals. Carbon removal is a very hopeful concept. It's encouraging to think that we can remove carbon from the atmosphere, but as Antonius will get into more later in his presentation, the difference in scale in between what we are able to remove and what is already in the atmosphere is vast. We are only able to remove right now with existing technologies very small amounts of carbon. So very important to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. Let someone else in. So how does it work? First of all, eliminate emissions. Then second of all, this is a graphic. There are many like this, but this gives a brief overview of how we might stay below 2 degrees C. There are others. I know Antonius will have one for 1.5. But really, if we look at this, the big highlight here is that in the big green bucket here, most of how we reach this below 2 degrees threshold is with conventional abatement technology. So really important to emphasize the importance of cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And then in this blue section down here, we can see negative emissions, hopefully growing, but they do start out, if we look at now, the amount of greenhouse gas that we're able to remove from the atmosphere here in 2020 is very small. It almost doesn't even show up here. So just to emphasize again with a little bit of a visual, the difference in scale between what we need to do and what negative emissions are currently able to do. So what are some examples when we talk about carbon removal? What does that even mean? So we'll hear a lot more about oceans and removing carbon. This graphic shows the existing conventional methods of removing carbon from the atmosphere. And you'll notice that most of them are on land. And ocean carbon removal is an emerging technology. A lot of really exciting stuff to think and talk about there. And I'm sure we have many people who already know a lot about that on the call because of this audience. So some of these examples, coastal blue carbon, lots more going on in the ocean. Accelerated chemical weathering of rocks. So there are some rocks that actually naturally absorb carbon dioxide, mineralized carbon dioxide, I should say. And that is a process that can be accelerated. There are machines that can remove carbon dioxide here. Direct air carbon capture, this is often called. And those can run, if they're run on renewable energy, they can be an effective way to remove greenhouse gas emissions and then store it down here in this graphic. We also see that storage can happen in basalt or in other geologic formation. And that is a very similar process to the chemical weathering of rocks. So you have those gases eventually going into rocks and mineralizing, becoming solid. This bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, sometimes called BECCS. This is another way of removing greenhouse gases. You can actually burn biomass and then store the emissions from that. And because biomass is made up of carbon that trees and other biomass pulled out of the atmosphere, that can be a net negative process if done right. And similarly, trees themselves remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so afforestation, reforestation is another method. And soil carbon is yet another method. There's carbon that is stored in the soil, and healthy soil has more carbon. So that's another way of doing carbon removal. So some resources, if people are interested, if they're new to the subject of carbon removal and want to learn more, you can go to these resources, and you can always find this here by going to intro.carbonremoval.nyc. So for now, I'm excited to get into our speakers. So we're going to start with Dan Yawitz, who is the director of the Climate Pathfinders Foundation. And the Climate Pathfinders Foundation is a new funder in the climate impact space with a high risk tolerance. So they're able to focus on long time frames and emerging climate solutions in particular. And Dan is a funder of some of the work that we'll hear about later. And I think Dan has a presentation for us now. A little brief intro.
Great, thanks, Peter. Just a housekeeping note, I think someone maybe opened a LaCroix and is now doing some yoga, whoever that is, maybe if they can mute themselves, that'd be great. I'm gonna share my screen here. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yep, okay. So I guess before I get into this, I'll just reframe why I'm talking here. I'm not a scientist or expert in this field. I'm new to climate change overall, but I'm half of the team at Climate Pathfinders Foundation, and we are eager to fund future solutions to climate stability. And full disclosure, we are one of the funders behind Antonius's work that you'll see later. The reason I thought it'd be helpful to share some thoughts would be speaking more to the folks in the room who are new to removal and to oceans, to just give a lay person's perspective on why this is so exciting to someone new to the field. So that's my goal here. This is probably a familiar scene for most of you here. This is obviously Jaws, the scene where he's chumming the water, gets a glimpse of the shark, steps back, and has this reaction shot that is just kind of timeless. And I think everybody can probably fill in what comes next. Feel free to shout it out if you know it.
We're gonna need a bigger boat.
You're gonna need a bigger boat, exactly. So this was my reaction when I first saw the data that Peter just put up on the screen about the scale of negative emissions that we're going to need to hit 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius. And then, so that's the shark. And then the boat is, how far we are from that today, and how many orders of magnitude we still have to scale even some of the more established negative emissions pathways. So this was my moment to say, what's the bigger boat that we need? And oceans, I think, is part of that. So I'm going to try to get everybody pumped about ocean CDR. I'm just going to pepper this with lots of cheesy ocean metaphors here. But basically, I kind of think of oceans as exciting and negative emissions for two reasons, really. One is we do just need a bigger boat. We do just need more options. Even some of this quote unquote established pathways like direct air capture or BECCS that Peter mentioned, they are established in relative terms, but they still have a long way to go. They still have new technologies, and it's still worthwhile to make sure that we're looking at all the tools and having as big a toolkit as possible. So more is more when it comes to removal technology, and oceans should be part of that. David Keith agrees, if I could paraphrase him. This was his tweet from last month on the heels of, if you caught the Economist article sort of envisioning what the world would look like in 2040 or 2050 after we've cleaned up atmospheric greenhouse gases. if I assume a lot of people are familiar with David Keith, but suffice to say, he's a thought leader in the space of climate stabilization technology. And so to see him look at oceans, is your ears perk up, I would say. So a second reason is that, more is more in terms of solution, but there really also are some reasons to think that oceans may have some serious advantages compared to some of the existing pathways in terms of cost, permanence, like Peter mentioned, and scalability. So this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just a few that come to mind. One, if you were to pick direct air capture, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of energy in electricity and heat to collect the carbon dioxide that's in the air, because it's unconcentrated. So it just takes a lot of energy to get it concentrated and out of the air. To paraphrase Greg Rao, who's one of the leading scientists, academics in this field, and maybe on the call, he can correct me if I misquote him here, but to paraphrase him, the ocean's already doing a lot of the hard work of capturing and collecting and concentrating that CO2. So there's an argument for leveraging that as opposed to pulling it out of the air. If the ocean is already absorbing a lot of it and concentrating it, there's an opportunity there. Another reason is the oceans are already basically where nature sends its carbon dioxide when it wants to get rid of it for a long time. So, the carbon cycle has carbon dioxide, on all sorts of time frames, cycling through plants and animals on land, and, but when nature puts carbon dioxide away for the long term, it goes into and through the oceans into rocks. So there's an argument to just accelerate those natural processes that are already kind of what I'd call long-term storage, long-term parking for CO2. And then, oceans are not just one thing, as Antonius will get into. There are toolboxes within this toolbox here. So there's a whole, plethora of options. A lot of them still have more questions than answers, but there's enough there that, we should dig into all this. So, broadly categorizing them in my head, Antonius will show you some different terms, but, you have a category of solutions that accelerate marine plants and their photosynthesis process, taking CO2 out of the ocean. And then there's a whole toolkit that's related to kind of enhancing and accelerating natural ocean chemistry. But again, all of that is with the goal of really pushing the CO2 down to the seafloor and into rocks for long-term storage. There's a lot to dig into here and a lot of tools. It's really exciting. Like I said, kind of more, lots of potential, but still a lot of questions to answer. And I'm sure Antonius will get into this. And I just end on a note of kind of enthusiasm here. There's no reason to wait. Depending on what sort of resources you can bring to bear on this, there are a lot of opportunities to bring your communication skills, your talent, your money. If you're a funder, there's a lot of new science that's still being developed, companies that are sprouting up here, new policies that need to be tweaked or designed if that's your thing. So lots of realms for people to get involved, and we hope you will. So there's my email. Would love to chat with anybody that wants to follow up on anything I've said, and thanks for being here. Peter, I'll turn it back to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dan. That's great. All right, so I am thrilled to introduce Antonius. Antonius Gagern is a senior associate at CEA Consulting, where he supports foundations, NGOs, and development institutions in the field of natural resource management and economics. And he's also a program officer of ClimateWorks' Ocean CDR Fund. And in this capacity, his team manages a growing pipeline of projects to build the field of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, including scientific research, community building, links to market, policy, and advocacy. And that's what he's here to speak to us about today. So I'm excited to introduce Antonius.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks, Dan, for the introduction. I think that really set the stage nicely. And hi, everyone. I am seeing a few familiar faces, a few Nice to see you all here. What I'm going to do is I'll share my screen and see if I can do it in a way that later on I can show a little video. So please bear with me if that doesn't work out. But so as Peter was saying, I work for CA Consulting, and that's a consulting firm that works with a lot of philanthropic organizations. And one of the roles that I currently have is to be the program officer of Climate Works for the Ocean CDR fund. It's a relatively new fund. And so for a little less than a year, we've been thinking about how to build the field of ocean CDR in a way that those ocean CDR approaches that merit some attention will get the airtime and will get the attention from the right people to little by little move up the ladder of technological readiness and to get the kind of funding and policy attention that they need to be scaled up. So for this call, for this presentation today, I wanted to make sure there are 4 takeaways that you go home with. One is that in the last 200 years, we've emitted a lot of CO2, and that we might have to remove up to 1 trillion or 1.2 trillion tons of CO2 by 2100. 3, that the carbon dioxide removal technologies that are currently in the portfolio have so far removed only a tiny fraction of what we will have to remove. And these technologies are still in their infancy, but some of them have been around for some time, and it's been really difficult to get traction for them. And so these definitely need a lot of attention, but in addition, the ocean should be seriously considered in the CDR portfolio. So I'll go through a few slides to try and make some of these points, and then show you the Ocean CDR platform that we just launched, which is an opportunity for everybody interested in this field to engage with peers, ask questions, see what's going on. So here's a graph of the CO2 emissions over the last 200 years. And if you look at the fate of that CO2, it looks a little bit like that. The ocean has taken up 27% of all of the CO2 that humans have emitted in the last 200 years. And that's approximately, I think, 400 million tons or something like that. The soils have also taken up almost a quarter, and the rest remains in the atmosphere. The reason why it enters the ocean and the soil is because just the physical attributes of these spheres make for the gas exchange to happen, and in the biosphere it allows through photosynthesis to enter these spheres. But half of all of the emissions end up in the atmosphere and remain in the atmosphere. If it wasn't for the ability of the ocean and the soil to take up some of the emissions, we would already be living in a climate in a world that would be too hot for us to stand. So if we look at the pathways that are ahead of us, the different alternatives that are ahead of us in terms of CO2 emissions, there are projections of business as usual. There are projections about following the current policies. There are projections about the pledges and targets that all countries have made. And then you can see the gap between all of those emission ambitions and the goal that the Paris Agreement in 2015 has kind of set, which is a 1.5 degree Celsius future, or a 2 degree Celsius future. And you can see that the gap between where we are currently heading with current policies, and even if all of the pledges and targets are met, and a future of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius is significant. And it's important to remember that a 1.5 degree Celsius future is not is not a very nice future. It is one of increased flooding and increased storms. It is one where coral reefs, most of them will likely disappear. And so already the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway is a dire outlook. So this is just to really drive home the message that some more ambition is required, but in addition to that ambition, we need carbon dioxide removal one way or another. If you look at the IPCC scenarios of the special report of 2019, then you can see that depending on your projections on, for example, energy demand and the energy mix, etc., in any case, you will require significant amounts of negative emissions. So everything that is below this zero line here is an expectation for negative emissions. And so in the case of this pathway forward, for example, where we expect not to act very quickly as a global community to the climate crisis, we might require up to 1 trillion or so tons of CO2 removed in the next 80 years. And so note that in this particular case, by 2050, our carbon dioxide removal industry would have to be half as powerful as our current global fossil fuel industry. If you then look at what is currently happening in terms of the response on carbon dioxide removal, it is not much. There are, of course, very important nature-based approaches that I'm not going into detail here, of reforestation and blue carbon protection, etc., that add to this mix. But here's just an example of carbon capture and storage, which at least in the IPCC reports is highlighted as one of the most important approaches, particularly in combination with bioenergy, as Peter said. And that is not on track at all. So we're currently at maybe in the US, maybe at 2 million tons of CO2 capture and storage per year. And if we're lucky, by 2025, there will be 10 million tons, but it doesn't scale as quickly as needed. This is a figure that shows the ambition that we should have based on the International Energy Agency's sustainable development scenarios. This is depressing, but I think particularly as carbon markets and policies will improve for the CDR field at large, some of these terrestrial and also direct air capture technologies will really start to scale. But in addition to that growing portfolio, which at the moment is definitely not on track, the ocean deserves some real attention as an additional set of approaches in the CDR portfolio. And here's a nice figure that is a little difficult to discern at first sight, but basically this is the anthropogenic emissions, the disruption of the global carbon cycle through anthropogenic emissions. And so this big arrow here of fossil fuel emissions, 35 gigatons per year, shows an annual flow from gas reserves, from oil reserves, from coal reserves, These reserves, they don't scale with the arrow size. It's just they scale among each other, and the arrows scale among each other. But what you see is that fossil fuels and land use change are pushing something like 41 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere, and the biosphere is taking up some, and the ocean is taking up some. And then if you look at the actual stock of CO2 that is currently dissolved in the ocean versus in the soils, you can quickly see the vast potential of the ocean as a storage for CO2. And it's important to note here the way the CO2 that has entered the ocean in the past 150, 200 years has been absolutely detrimental to the ocean. Since as CO2 enters the ocean, the acidity increases. And so in the last 150 years alone, the acidity has increased by something like 30% of the ocean, putting a lot of species at real peril. But the ocean CDR approaches are really about ways to capture and remove the CO2 that is absorbed by the ocean in a way that is harmless for the ocean. So it's definitely not about increasing, it's definitely not about drawing down CO2 at the cost of acidification. In some cases, it's even the opposite. It's decreasing acidification while at the same time drawing down CO2. So the Climate Works Ocean Carbon Dioxide Fund has taken stock of the ocean CDR community a little over a year ago, and realized that really what's missing at the moment is a field of ocean carbon dioxide removal that is comparable to other technologies that are being thought about and developed, like direct air capture and others. So we're trying to bring this field to a place where the ocean CDR approaches can be properly evaluated, and where they meet the standard of safe and scalable CO2 removal. They should be pushed in the way where it can be commercially and safely done at scale. And so what we're focusing on here is closing knowledge gaps, building the ocean CDR field more generally, driving consensus in the expert community, informing policy, doing advocacy, and bringing entrepreneurs and investors together to take it to the next level. So one of the things that we did in the last few months is build this oceancdr.net platform that I'm going to run through now for 10 or 15 minutes or so, because I think it's a nice way to show a few examples of ocean CDR and also advertise for this platform, since we hope that this really becomes a useful tool for practitioners and funders and entrepreneurs and investors to get the right information, to exchange ideas, to try and understand what else is happening in the space and make the right connections. So Peter, maybe you can tell me if you can still see this. I don't
think so. So far we just see a gray screen.
Yeah, I have to reshare then. So let me do this.
Great, we can see that.
Yeah, okay. So this is the oceancdr.net platform, and we just launched it, so there are still a few glitches. I hope the demonstration works now, but what we aimed for was a place where everybody who's interested in ocean CDR, working on ocean CDR, or is really involved in it already, has a place where they can, within a few minutes, understand the basics of different approaches, and then dive deeper and exchange ideas and engage in conversations if they want more detail. So as a high-level overview, there are 8 approaches that we are focusing on here. Maybe the list of the CDR portfolio will grow over time, but basically it is a biological, and it's a set of biological and set of abiotic carbon pumps that we are focusing on. And the biological pump is the ocean's ability to take CO2 through photosynthesis into plant material, and then through its conversion in the food web, little by little, have some of the carbon that is fixated from through photosynthesis into marine plants actually at some point escape the food web and make it to the deep ocean, and thereby store some CO2 for a very long time. And here are 4 approaches that we've looked at in a little more detail and describe in a little more detail. 2 of them, artificial upwelling and ocean fertilization, are about boosting the net primary production, with the idea being that if primary production increases, the flux of carbon through the food web also increases, and thereby the net export of carbon also increases. Blue carbon management is the management, protection, and reforestation of mangroves and salt marshes and seagrasses, which in their soil particularly store a lot of carbon and are in danger in some places of the world, and have been the focus of a lot of the ocean CDR conversation in the past. And then finally, macroalgae cultivation, which is a way to increase also the photosynthetic uptake of CO2, and then do something with those leaves, either sink them to the ocean floor or transport them back, transport them into a form and into a product form that is permanent. And so I don't want to go into too much detail on each one of them, but just provide a sneak preview of the detail that is available here in the approach sections. So we do provide a bit of a rationale for why macroalgae cultivation might theoretically be interesting. I'll come back to this image in a second. The technical potential based on the current understanding of that science, the environmental impacts that might come from it, and the cost considerations. And so for each one of those approaches, we worked with a UK-based firm, Cognitive Media, to produce a few of these static images that we want the broader community to use in communications. So please feel free to use them as much as you want. We have the optionality of downloading them in a high resolution at some point soon. But here's an example of visualizing what macroalgae does. Macroalgae can either be found free floating in the ocean, as for example sargassum does, or you can farm it. And so as the CO2 enters the seawater and the algae take up that CO2, some of it is exported to the depth as the leaves fall off, or as you sink the biomass to the deep ocean. And some of it could theoretically, or is already being transported to international supply chains to actually do something with that seaweed. In some cases, if it is a carrageenan, for example, or short-lived bioproducts like food, the CO2 footprint is not as impressive, like the carbon dioxide removal impact is not as impressive. But if you sink them to the ocean floor, it is actually quite interesting. You can do that with free-floating algae or with cultivated, farmed algae. I'm not going to go through each one in detail here, but I'm going to select a few of those that you might not have heard too much about. One of them is artificial upwelling in this biological pathways. So artificial upwelling is the idea of pulling up nutrients from the depth that are not as available at the surface ocean in order to fertilize phytoplankton and other microorganisms, or even fertilize farmed algae, to then boost the primary production and increase the net downward movement of carbon. Another approach that might be interesting for folks, and Dan just mentioned it, is alkalinity enhancement. And I want to spend a little more time on that because we've produced a little video about it that I would like to show. It's just a 4-minute video. Some of you probably have seen it, but I wanted to show this because it's a nice introduction into the broader ocean CDR universe. So I'll just, Peter, you'll tell me if that doesn't work, please.
Yeah,
when it comes to countering the troubling effects of climate change, we have a powerful ally, the ocean, which absorbs 90% of our planet's excess heat and removes around 1/4 of our CO2 emissions from the atmosphere. Unfortunately, we live with the highest levels of heat-trapping atmospheric carbon dioxide in human history, which is taking an enormous toll on the oceans. Raised CO2 levels not only heat up the oceans and let sea levels rise, but also cause an increase in ocean acidity, giving our ally a bad case of heartburn. This is extremely serious for the millions of species that have evolved to survive in a delicately balanced ecosystem. Acidity challenges corals, shellfish, and some microscopic algae, impacting large parts of the ocean's food webs. Right now, to help save the ocean's plants and animals, as well as the people who rely on them for their livelihood and food, we need to go to zero on new CO2 emissions, and we need to find ways to remove 1 trillion tons of atmospheric CO2. So, how might this happen? The Earth has 2 natural ways of consuming CO2. One involves the biological carbon cycle of photosynthesis that locks a portion of the consumed carbon into soils and ocean sediments. The second is part of a larger but much slower geologic carbon cycle, where surface rocks weather with rain and atmospheric CO2 to produce alkaline carbon molecules that wash into the ocean. Think of it as the land giving the ocean a giant antacid that over long timescales also locks away billions of tons of atmospheric CO2. These natural processes eventually help the planet to recover and rebalance, but not in a human-relevant timescale. However, there are ways to drastically speed up these processes. One particularly intriguing approach is ocean alkalinity enhancement, which accelerates the geologic cycle, consuming both CO2 and ocean acidity. There are different proposals to do this, such as adding finely ground alkaline rock to soils in the ocean or in controlled reactors. Take, for example, a scheme for accelerating the weathering of limestone. Here, seawater and CO2-rich flue gas are pumped through a reactor containing crushed limestone. In the reactor, CO2 is consumed and the resulting alkalized seawater is returned to the ocean. On a small scale, comparable systems are commonly used to treat home saltwater aquaria. Similarly, alkaline solution is added to the seawater in which oyster larvae are commercially grown, thereby neutralizing acidity and increasing the young oyster's survival rates. The proceeding suggests that similar actions could be taken at larger scales, but important uncertainties would first need to be carefully studied. Can ocean alkalinity enhancement really benefit marine ecosystems by protecting them from ocean acidification? How will organisms and ecosystems respond to trace elements contained in alkaline rocks? As for cost, initial assessments suggest that this approach can remove a ton of CO2 for as little as $10, well within an acceptable cost range. But at large scales, what are the true costs? And what are the wider economic, environmental, and societal consequences of such actions relative to benefits? It's time for a scientific assessment of all potential methods of CO2 and ocean acidity reduction, including ocean alkalinity enhancement, to better inform policy and decision makers. Right now, a growing community of scientists, NGOs, government institutions, and entrepreneurs is forming around this important topic. To find out more, please visit our website.
So, did that work out for everybody?
Yeah, that worked well.
Okay. Okay, great. So just to show you some of the functionalities of this web page, the approaches page is available for everybody who has not signed up as a member here. The rest of the functionalities is only available for people who create a little profile. And so I'm going to run through those briefly with a few examples. So one of them, which since we just started, there's not a lot of action here yet, but is the forum. We expect this to be a place where a lot of the questions in this field are being discussed at a faster pace than maybe the scientific literature. And for each one of those, for the entire web page, for the entire portal there, you can always sort by the ocean CDR approaches or by the keywords that you're particularly interested in, or you can search for specific words here in the search bar. And so there is, whenever there is a comment or a new forum addition by somebody, you can easily just reply to it, or you can add a document to it, etc. So that is one thing that we are really hopeful will spark some conversations. The second piece is the resources piece. So let's say you watch the 4-minute alkalinity video and are really intrigued and want to know more, and you filter for alkalinity enhancement, and you get 37 hits here, and you want to know a little more about each one of them, but you don't have necessarily time or the detailed technical understanding to read through all of these papers. So what we've done here is we curated so far, I think, 250 papers in going through them one by one, and we had the help from Sophie Gill and James, sorry for forgetting the last name now, at UCSB, and they went through each of the papers and provided a bit of a description that goes beyond the abstract, and added a little bit of blurb on why they thought this was a particularly interesting or relevant addition to the literature. And then there are ways to download these resources here. So it is relatively easy to filter for the things that you're particularly interested in, say alkalinity enhancement and governance, and you're quickly with the the resources that matter most. Now, the community tab has a few functionalities. One is an overview of the members that are part of this. There are 85 members now, which is great since we just launched this. And as you scroll through this, this is really a great representation of the people working in this field. And for each one of those experts or people interested in the field, there's an ability to just, Brad, I'm going to show yours now for a second. I hope you don't mind. So there's a bit of a bio blurb here, and some detail on the projects and discussions or events that these experts have entered so far. And then finally, there is the projects page, which again can be sorted in the same way as the resources and the forum, and it has all of the projects that members uploaded themselves and tagged themselves. So here's, for example, a project that Phil Renforth entered that's about testing the efficiency of olivine spreading at beaches for alkalinity enhancement and CO2 drawdown. And I think, and then there's the events board and job board. So the events I just entered the event of this webinar here. Whenever you click on those events, you'll be able to put them on your timeline or on your profile, and so that allows others to see who of this community is attending that event, but it also allows you to keep track of the events that you want to attend. So there are a number of other functionalities, but I'm going to stop here for now. Maybe there are questions and follow-ups that I go in a little more detail, but I'm going to stop here for the time being.
Great. Thank you, Antonius. That was wonderful. I'm excited to check it out more. So does anyone have questions? Feel free to speak them or put them in the chat.
I don't have any questions. It's also new to me that I feel like I need to just get in there and learn about it more, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very new and excited for this website. It really seems to do a great job of laying forth like both introductory content as well as more advanced content. So yeah, excited for this as a way to just help people learn more about that, myself included.
Yeah, I'm grateful for those types of videos that explain, you know, what's happening and all those kinds of things.
Yeah. We have another question here in the chat. It says, what's the legal overview of what is or is not possible in international waters? You know how to answer that, Antonius?
I'm not sure if the question refers to a paper that I just showed during the presentation, or if it is a broader question about what I think is possible or not, legally speaking.
Yeah, we could have clarification maybe from Rohit. I think of what is allowed in terms of adding and subtracting things is what comes to mind. So we have clarification. It's a broader question. What are the constraints that we need to be aware of within the ocean?
Yeah. So I'm just back in the resources page now. because there are a few really good papers about that, and I'm not expert enough to talk about it high level and in a comprehensive way. But I think this would be an opportunity to check out some of the resources based on specific approaches or on general approaches. So ocean fertilization was really one of the starting points for ocean carbon dioxide removal, and has received a lot of criticism, which really set back that approach by decades. Rightly so or not, I am actually not so sure. But based on the experiences with ocean iron fertilization, a lot of literature was produced on what is legally possible and what should be or should not be legally possible. And so I find particularly the ocean fertilization and governance literature interesting in that respect. So the easiest summary, I think, at this point that I can provide is that it is even difficult to test some of these approaches purely for research. Through this Ocean CDR fund at ClimateWorks, we are funding a number of oceanographic institutes to test the efficiency and side effects of ocean alkalinity enhancement. And it has been quite difficult for the researchers to even get permits for field tests. So in the laboratory it's fine, and mesocosm is fine, but really going into the field and testing it, even if it's not for commercial applications, is difficult in a lot of cases. But it varies, of course, from case to case. You can do as much blue carbon conservation and reforestation as you want, legally speaking, if the financial interests are there. But iron fertilization or ocean alkalinity enhancement is definitely more tricky.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know that historically there has been controversy around like adding iron to the ocean as a form of enhancement, and making those changes can have direct impacts on livelihoods in various countries. You know, increasing nutrient content, fishing comes to mind, but all kinds of other ecological impacts. So yeah, very interesting question. Any other questions for us? Oh yeah, I think we have a raised hand. I can't quite hear though. I can't hear you. Abhinav, I hope I'm saying that right.
No.
So far, I can't hear. Maybe go to the chat. I can repeat it. Okay, great.
In the meantime, maybe I can point out that there are right now a number of really interesting projects happening on ocean CDR to drive the field forward a little bit. Some of them are funded or co-funded by us, some others aren't. But there's really, in the last 1.5 years alone, so much has happened to bring this field forward. And maybe I can just talk about a few off the top of my head, particularly those that we've been funding come to mind. One is the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine in 2018 produced a paper on negative emission technologies, but they omitted ocean CDR approaches except for blue carbon management. And so we are funding the National Academies of Science now to go into detail on each one of those ocean CDR approaches and really assess, based on the current knowledge, what the CDR potential is of each one of them, under which conditions and assumptions, what the costs and cost inhibitors are at the moment, what the policy landscape looks like at the moment, and what a science research agenda would have to look like to fill the knowledge gaps that are still outstanding. There's another project that is run by Brad Ack and David Koweek, which is the Ocean Visions Ocean CDR Task Force. Ocean Visions is a consortium of 12 academic institutes with their tech accelerators and the impact investors that are loosely associated to those, and they focus on ocean solutions, CDR being one of them. And so this task force in particular is one of the less sciencey projects that we are funding, but really one that tries to bring together the community and ask the question, what needs to happen in the next 5 years to get these approaches from where they are now to a place where they can really be taken up by entrepreneurs and where investors are really interested and where policy barriers are removed and so on. If you want to find out more about those, you can also check out the Ocean CDR webpage. They're all listed there.
That's great. And that directly actually gets to one of the questions we had in the chat from Abhinav. Have you talked to any policymakers, he asks, and what are some policy related challenges and how shall we overcome them?
Well, you know, yes, we have. And this is definitely an area where we're going to engage much more in now that we've kind of covered the groundwork. But there is some promising, things happening actually. In the EU, there's a lot of interest in better understanding the potential of ocean CDR as part of the CDR portfolio, particularly now as countries are getting more ambitious with their CO2 goals. In Canada, there are also really interesting signs of government interest in different negative emission technologies, including the ocean. And in the US, there is just recently Senator Murkowski and Senator Whitehouse I think sponsored a bill, I forgot the name of it now, but it basically includes the exploration of the potential of ocean CDR approaches, which is an important first step in recognizing its importance and an important first step for us to engage with their teams a little more, and for everybody who works in this field to engage and be part of shaping these policies. A lot at the moment is permits, and in some cases it's not clear who owns the right of granting permits in the ocean, but there are some interesting projects that are also currently trying to get closer to those questions. Will Burns has been one of the leading academics trying to figure out what the governance of all of these ocean geoengineering approaches currently is and how it could benefit from policy change. And there are others like Michael Gerber at Columbia Law who are working on those things more specifically on a legal law by law level. Great.
Yeah, and we have a link in the chat from ASA to the Senate hearing related legislation by Senator Murkowski and Whitehouse, the CREATE Act that Antonius just mentioned. And we have a couple questions in the chat as well. We have, are all bodies of water the same, or would you prefer to work, say, in the Mediterranean as opposed to another location, say, in colder climate? Imagine that probably varies depending on the type of removal that we're talking about, but maybe, Antonius, do you know much about different regions in the ocean and if they are optimized for particular types of removal?
Yeah, definitely. Different approaches ask for different conditions, but I don't know enough about it to talk about it in detail.
Yeah, maybe a follow-up with a scientist who studies that could be an interesting exploration into that. Good question. All right, so we have another question. What are some of the realistic or achievable technical milestones in the next few years that you expect with the current momentum in the broader ocean CDR field?
Yeah, I think we will see a lot of progress on ocean alkalinity enhancement, both on actually the addition of alkaline material to the ocean and the electrochemical approaches that allow for the addition of alkaline water to the ocean. And there are currently at least 7 relatively big research projects going on to test for the efficiency and for the side effects. And then there are a number of entrepreneurs and projects that actually try to get some of these approaches to a level where they can eventually be commercially interesting. One of them is a project that Greg Rao and Mike Helland are running at Planetary Hydrogen, this is about the electrolysis of seawater and the subsequent alkalization of water. And they are at a stage where they are building pilots to test it. Similarly, Jeremy Lay, based in Paris, is thinking about a similar approach, which produces synthetic brucite as an output, but a similar electrochemical approach. And finally, there's one interesting concept that Jess Atkins at UCLA is thinking about, at Caltech is thinking about, which is to combine cargo ships with ocean liming, with ocean alkalinity enhancement, because these cargo ships travel empty in most of the cases, and adding a little bit of alkaline material to them and combining that alkaline material with the seawater and the flue gas from the exhaust pipes might allow for quite efficient ocean alkalinity enhancement approaches. And so I expect in the next few years some real data coming out of these initial pilot testing stages.
A really interesting idea. Great dispersal method where we already send these cargo ships everywhere, so why not use them? Interesting.
And one other project that I forgot to mention is Project Vesta, which proposes to spread fine olivine sand at dissipative beaches, or at beaches in general, to increase the alkalinity of the surrounding seawater. And that is not so much a technical challenge, but it is nevertheless a challenge of logistics and testing and verification. And in the next couple of years, I'm expecting a lot new information out of these ocean alkalinity enhancement projects.
All right. So any other questions that we have? There's one in the chat. Can you provide the list of these shovel-ready projects?
Sorry, what are shovel-ready projects?
I think projects that are ready to go now. So things that are, yeah, okay. Yeah, so projects that are already ready for deployment. Do you have a mental list of those off the top of your head, or would there be a good place to go to find those?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, macroalgae cultivation and the ranching of free-floating sargassum and the protection of blue carbon ecosystems are in that category. These are technically relatively simple and easy to monitor approaches with an immediate impact that can be measured relatively easily. And they are already happening. Markets already exist for those. But there's a bit of a question on the scale, the potential of carbon dioxide removal for them. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions?
I've got a question for Antonius.
Great, go ahead.
Just back to the policy questions that were brought up. I guess, Antonius, if I can just tell you how I understand it and see if you agree with that. I mean, you mentioned some federal legislation. You focused on kind of what are maybe some of the permitting obstacles to doing the tests. Do you see it as also, you know, a big question about how people can get paid to remove carbon and sequester carbon, and, you know, what are some of the policy incentives that, you know, would enable businesses to be started around, you know, these techniques? I mean, versus, you know, we may want and need these removal techniques purely as a public good climate cleanup, you know, toolkit, but then there's also policies that can incentivize people through, you know, something akin to 45Q or, you know, the likes that would let people get paid for carbon removal credits. Is that the way you think about it as well, in terms of, you know, other financial incentives and policies that could spur action to scale?
Yeah, when I think about policy, I think about three levels. One is public funds for research, because the little philanthropic money that is available for research is just not enough to get it right. And you got to get it right to even talk about permitting. So I would really advocate for significant public spending on research in this field as quickly as possible, as much as possible, to then be able to argue for easing the permitting landscape little by little. Currently, definitely, permitting is a ginormous bottleneck, but the reason that it is that we don't know enough about the side effects of these approaches. One of the reasons is, right? And then once the permitting is in place, you need the financial incentives to get these projects up to scale. In the same way that the financial incentives were given to solar, were given to wind, and are now given to carbon capture and storage and to enhanced oil recovery. So in a way, it doesn't have to be sequenced exactly that way. But what we need in terms of policy is this whole package of understanding enough in order to allow it, and then not only allow it, but enable it through financial incentives. Solar and wind are pretty much ready now to survive on their own, right? But they couldn't have survived the first 30 years of research and development.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, distinct and really clear direction there. I mean, we just need to know more to ease that bottleneck of permitting. It makes a lot of sense.
Well, it's interesting. In a few of those cases, say macroalgae cultivation, blue carbon management, even ocean alkalinity enhancement, there are groups forming now who are working on protocols, on methodologies for the verification that is signed off by accreditors of the voluntary carbon market, which allow down the line, once you can deploy these technologies, to subsidize them through the voluntary market. And the voluntary market is always an important first step for, say, for example, the low carbon fuel standard or other projects like that. And these protocols and methodologies are key first things that also need to be invested in, that don't require any policy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It makes it clear what we're talking about when we're talking about a ton of removal or something like that. It makes it really clear. It's verified in the same way.
Yeah. So I think the goal of the Ocean CDR community should be, in the next 10 years or so, get the most promising approaches to a place where they could really be scaled and commercialized, if they prove to be safe and effective and cost effective and whatnot. So all of these barriers have to be removed as quickly as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. We have in the chat, Climate Foundation is building artificial kelp forest to promote primary production, and a link to Climate Foundation. So more information there if anyone's interested.
Yeah. Maybe if I can, I can talk a little bit about one project that we're doing now on seaweed, because it's really there's really a question about whether or not seaweed can play a role in ocean carbon dioxide removal. There have been a lot of proposals flying around, and depending on the fate of the seaweed, or depending on where it's grown and how it's grown, or what products it ends up in, there might be a positive or a negative carbon footprint of that operation. And so we are just reviewing the second round of proposals, the final proposals of an RFP that we sent out almost 2 months ago now, with the question, with the request to build a sensitivity analysis that is a little similar to this New York Times "should I buy or should I rent" algorithm, where you can just enter a few of the core assumptions that you have about yield, that you have about product fate, that you have about the life cycle implications of the product pathways, etc., and then see how, and then add also factors of demand and of price elasticities to supply, and all of that, and then ask the question, under which assumptions of all of these variables would seaweed be an interesting candidate for ocean CDR? Because right now we don't know, and there are at least 20 projects that are betting on this, on macroalgae cultivation from an economic, like from a commercial standpoint, and it's not clear yet if it really turns out to be beneficial. Yeah, that's a project that I'm really excited about, and which will, in my mind, shed a light on really under what conditions this will work out. And one finding could be that it only works out if the carbon market increases to $120 per ton, or we could find that the only way to make this work is if we bundle the seaweed and sink it, rather than produce carrageenan and soy alternatives from it. And so we're trying to figure out some of these questions in that project.
Yeah, that's great. We really are in the lab stage here for most or all of these, and so many questions to answer. Question about recording. Yes, this will be available after. I'll send it out and it will be posted for anyone to view if you were here, or for anyone who wasn't here as well. All right, so we're coming up on the end of our time here. Any other last questions before we wrap up? All right, so seeing none, Antonius, thank you so much for joining us. This was fascinating, and there's so much potential here, a lot to learn. Ocean CDR is one of my favorite areas, potentially huge, and just a lot to learn. So thank you for taking the time to share, and thank you for taking the time to help bring this tool into the world. I'm excited to learn more from oceancdr.net in the future, and I'm hoping that we have a large community coming around it, and a lot more information coming out soon. So thank you. Thank you to Dan as well for joining and speaking about funding. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll have another Carbon Removal NYC sometime soon, none scheduled yet, but the next time we have a good speaker to bring you, we will do so via Zoom. So stay safe.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Antonius. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.